Hello everybody, this is Mr. Laubach. In this short video, I want to go over President Martin Van Buren. So I'll start by talking a little bit about his background and then how he got elected and some of the major events while he was president. So Martin Van Buren was the 8th president of the United States. He was a Democrat, of course. He served one term from 1837 to 1841. He was the president right after Andrew Jackson. So here's some background information about Van Buren. He was a lawyer from Kinderhook, New York. Kinderhook is in upstate New York. So he was a very well-known lawyer in the region. He was very active in New York politics. He was a state senator. He was a U.S. senator. He eventually became the governor of New York for a brief period of time before he left to help Andrew Jackson. Van Buren is often given credit for helping to start the Democratic Party, and he was very important within the party. He was a big advocate pushing for modern campaigning, which we know began during the Jackson administration. He had a couple of nicknames, but a frequently used nickname was the Little Magician. So he was considered a political wizard and was very politically savvy, hence the name Magician. Van Buren was a big supporter of Andrew Jackson, and he actually was Andrew Jackson's representative or surrogate in the North. And during Jackson's second term, he became the vice president for Andrew Jackson after John C. Calhoun stepped down because of a bunch of differences he was having with Jackson, including the nullification crisis. Now, ironically, the personality of Van Buren was very different than Andrew Jackson. Van Buren was a mild, very well-mannered, unassuming person, unlike Andrew Jackson, who was very rough and tumble, very gruff, and very combative. Another interesting thing about Van Buren was that he was considered the first American-born president of the United States. Now, I know this sounds weird, but what this meant was that he was the first president that was born after the Declaration of Independence was signed and the United States actually became the United States. Now, let's talk about how Van Buren won the election of 1836. So, as mentioned earlier, he helped to create modern campaigning. And a lot of supporters of Martin Van Buren during the campaign wore pins that said, "OK." The nickname for Van Buren was Old Kinderhook. So eventually, this term became known as I am OK. So there's a lot of different theories on how and why we use the term OK, but this is a very common one, that it was from Martin Van Buren. So quite a legacy he has there. Now, when Van Buren was campaigning, he promised to continue the policies of Andrew Jackson, who was very popular. And Andrew Jackson followed the tradition and precedent set by George Washington, and after 2 terms, he voluntarily resigned. Now, this is during the second party system where we have the Democrats and the Whigs. So what the Whigs tried to do to offset the popularity of the Democratic Party was they tried to run 3 separate candidates in different regions of the United States in hopes that Van Buren would not win a majority of the electoral votes, and that would then send the election to the House of Reps, who would decide. The Whigs were unsuccessful with this, and Martin Van Buren was able to win the majority of the popular votes, riding on the coattails of Andrew Jackson, and he became the 8th president. So while Van Buren was president, a big event during his presidency, which really shaped his presidency, was the Panic of 1837. So when we think panic, we should think of like a depression in the economy. Led to a lot of unemployment, businesses closing, banks closing, inflation. Now, one of the hallmarks of the economy during the 1800s was that it was very unstable. So there were a lot of peaks and valleys in the economy of the 1800s. And the Panic of 1837 was the biggest economic depression that the United States had faced until that point. Now, because of this depression, many Americans wanted to head west as the United States was expanding. Now, politically, the biggest issue with this was how would the spread of slavery be handled in new states and territories? Martin Van Buren tried to slow the expansion of the United States and did not want to annex Texas, who had become independent during this time. And the reason he did not want to annex Texas was the issue of slavery. He did not want slavery to spread into Texas. Now, Van Buren did not like slavery, but I certainly wouldn't go as far as to say that he was an abolitionist. Remember, he was a New Yorker where slavery had been outlawed for decades. So as mentioned earlier, the Panic of 1837 really marred the presidency of Van Buren. And he ended up losing his re-election bid to William Henry Harrison, who was a Whig, in the election of 1840. So after losing re-election, Martin Van Buren did not leave politics. And he actually resurfaced and ran for president again in 1848 as the candidate for the Free Soil Party. Now, the Free Soil Party's single platform was they wanted to prevent the expansion of slavery into new territories. This party was short-lived and eventually absorbed by the Republican Party. Martin Van Buren ended up dying in 1862. Now, Van Buren is one of those presidents that we don't really hear much about, but aside from being president, he had quite an impact on American politics. So I hope you found this video insightful and learned a little more about Martin Van Buren. Have a great rest of the day.